right, Dr. Rita, I really appreciate you taking your time with me today. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on your show.
So, what we're going to be talking about is a mixture of things. Of course, your couple of your books, Man-Made, the ET Chronicles, and your new documentary, The Holy Deception, correct?
Well, there's Holy Deception, and then there's Icon, deconstructing the archetypes of the ancients.
But what I love about a lot of your work is, just like Joseph Farrell's work, it all kind of interconnects. You don't really talk about something and it's completely different off the wall from, it kind of all interconnects. And I like that because you can expand more of your knowledge on a particular subject or whatever it is. But with your book, Man-Made, The Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods, give us a brief synopsis of this book and what was the message you were trying to give within the book?
Okay, wow. So the book looks at our history based on the mythic record. And so it starts with in the beginning, and it goes up until just after the Noah flood. And it portrays the information that we find in myth. And one of the things that I found in my research was this level of commonality of myth around the world. And it was almost like I had a giant Excel spreadsheet where at one end it said, in the beginning, and if you look at myths around the world, they almost all kind of start like, in the beginning. And then the flood story, and there were little pieces of narrative that you would find with a very similar storyline. So, for example, the creation of the sun, moon, and the stars was kind of like a bullet point that was covered by many, many cultures. The concept of a golden age. The idea that at some point in time there was a war between the gods and they ended up in the underworld, or in like Greek cosmology, Tartarus. And so those were put as like identification points on this grid. And then what I would look at was what was being said before, what was being said after. And what I found was basically they all told the same story. And so I didn't go into the book with an idea of this is what the book is going to say, and actually didn't go into the book with the idea in my head of there are ancient aliens or there aren't ancient aliens, or myth is fact or myth isn't fact. I just went in with an exploration in my mind, and I ended up coming out with some very clear conclusions based on what these stories tell you.
And that's one thing I did find fascinating about the book is you bring up a lot of questions. And a lot of questions, and I'm sort of the same way. When I create videos and I do my own type of research, I bring a lot of questions up. Because just like the quote in your documentary, which we will be getting into here shortly, you talk about, let's see if I have it. It's by Socrates. The only true wisdom is knowing you know nothing. And that is so true. You have many quotes within that documentary as well. But
don't ask me to say what they are, okay?
But let's go and get into, you talk about some of these stories and fables. What about the flood story? Now, where does the Noah's flood, does that have any kind of correlation to the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Sumerian flood story?
So in my research, there were two stories that I found to be the most global and the most consistent. And one of them was the story of the gods giving us fire. And it was just, it was always just this little teeny narrative, you know, the gods gave us fire, and it was a trickster god that gave us fire, and there maybe was a punishment attached to it. So Prometheus, for example, gave humanity fire, and as a punishment, they chained him to a rock so that an eagle could eat his liver every day, and it would become rejuvenated overnight. So that is one of the very consistent myths. And the other one is the flood story. Now, there are many that argue that you could have a flood anywhere, and that's what they would write down. However, when you start looking at the story, what happened before the story, what happened after the story, and actually the characters that are involved in the story and how the story is kind of paced, you quickly discover that we're not talking about different stories. So, for example, if I lived in New Orleans when there was Hurricane Katrina and there was the flooding that happened all over the city, that would be my flood story. And that would be what I would tell people. And maybe my grandchildren would tell the story of, like grandma was caught in this flood, and they would recount the story in the same way I recounted the story, or some facsimile thereof. But then there was, if you live on the Mississippi and it floods, or there's the tsunami that hit Indonesia, their story is inherently going to be different. Who was involved, how they survived the storm, etc., is all going to be inherently different. But you don't find that. One of my favorite narratives comes out of South America, and it tells of God's pissed, and he talks to two virtuous brothers, and they are, actually, a llama, because it does have some interesting twists. A llama tells them that there is an impending disaster coming, and it's going to be this flood. And so the brothers take their wives and their children, and they climb to the top of a mountain. And on the top of a mountain is an old man, and there are some animals. And as the waters rise, the mountain rises. And as the water reduces, the mountain goes down. And so if you compare that to the Noah story, Noah's a virtuous man. He's warned of a flood. Now, he does build a boat or an ark, but the ark lands on the top of a mountain. So we still have those pieces, and it's just this finite group with animals. And, you only need to do the digging to find out what's going on and how that story is just consistent. And it's just really the tip of the iceberg. And actually, it was researching the Noah story that got me started writing the ET Chronicles book in the first place.
So, the God in the Old Testament compared to the God in the New Testament, are we talking about the same God, or are these, because it seems like the one in the Old Testament is very warmongering, very fearful, very dooming and glooming, and the one in the New Testament seems a little bit more uplifting. Are we talking about many gods here, or just one?
All right, so no mean cards or letters on my commentary on this one. So, this is my story, and I'm sticking to it. So, if you read the mythological record, if you read ET Chronicles, because I just share stories, I don't say this is how it is, and I summarize some of the stories, but I share the stories for you to make your own decision on it. I don't just tell you this is what it is. One of the things that I found when I was writing the book is that I took the Bible. I mean, not that I'm like a Bible literate per se person, and I put it over there. And I took Zachariah Sitchin's material and I put it over there. And I said, if it comes into play, it comes into play. And if not, it doesn't. And what I ended up finding was that the narrative that you find in the Bible up until the flood is consistent with the mythic record, with one huge exception. In the mythic record, we have all of these gods, and there's a lot of stories about wars between this god and, Zeus against the Titans, and Kronos against Uranus, and, all these gods fighting with each other, and their very nasty exploits, and many of the things that they did. Well, if you only have one god, you can't have all those stories. So, as I like to bring it into contemporary times, like they had a big thing of whiteout, and they just whited out massive parts of the storyline. But the narrative actually plays out in the same chronology. There are those, and I want to come back to the chronology thing because there was something really interesting that I found. But there are those that suggest that there are multiple gods, but the war that happens between two groups of the gods, there was the sky god, so it would be Zeus in Greek cosmology, or Enlil in Sumerian cosmology, versus Kronos or Enki, Greek Sumerian. And there is this war that happens between the two of them. But they're also very different characters. Enlil is much more controlling, and he's the justifier, and he's the one that brings the wrath. He's the one that orders the flood. Enki, on the other hand, is the one that, said, read house, I'm warning you of this impending disaster. And so that is the kind and benevolent character we find in the Old Testament as well. And so there's people that suggest that they took these two aspects, or these two people, and put them into one God, which makes God seem really kind of schizophrenic. In the Old Testament, when you move into the New Testament, and really no cards on this one, they don't really talk about God. And God isn't really part of the story. It's Jesus' story. And so you have to say, but that's Jesus' story. It's not God's story. Where you get into the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, it's God and humanity's story.
And you already touched on the chronology part of it?
Well, there was just something really weird and interesting. So in Genesis, the first book of Genesis, it talks about the sun, moon, and stars being placed in the sky. And I think that was on the 3rd or 4th day. I don't recall. I don't have it in my hand. And, but then the next day, so it must have been the 4th day. So then on the 5th day, he creates all the plants and trees. Well, how can you create all the plants and trees if there's no sun, moon in the sky? No, backwards. He creates the plants, and then he puts the sun, the moon, and the stars in the sky. So it was the other way, which never made any sense to me at all. And so, and even in ET Chronicles, I said, well, was it a mistake? Did the chronologers mix these days up because they didn't know about photosynthesis and that you need a sun to make the crops grow? And I just put it out as a speculation. But what was interesting is as you start delving into myth deeper, when they talk about this creation narrative, and actually there's a war that happens, and in many of the stories, parts of the gods are used to create the mountains, and their blood became the rivers, and their hair became the trees. And then the sun, moon, and stars are put in the sky. So even the Bible, messed up as it sounds, followed the chronology of these older myths.
And one thing that has popped up in my mind, of course, with my own personal research, there seems to be a lot of questions with the books in the Bible, with a lot of these myths and fables, and other religions across the world, and many of the cultures across the world. There's a lot of questions, and one reason why I think of this, now this is probably my own personal conclusion, is that does the Council of Nicaea, did they have any part? Is that the reason why we have so many questions and there's so many loopholes? Because they took out a lot of things that were actually a big significance, and things that will actually bring up the answers and truth instead of bringing up more questions. What's your thought on that?
That's a great question. But the reality is that the Torah, or the Old Testament of the Bible, is the Old Testament. It's the Tanakh. That's the name of what you would call it in Hebrew. And it has gone unchanged. And so the Council of Nicaea did not do anything to influence Judaism or the Old Testament. And actually, in Christian Bibles, they've added 2 books, two books of the Maccabees that are not in the Jewish Old Testament Bible part. And so what they did with the New Testament and getting rid of all the Apocrypha really just stayed in that area, and they did not have any influence on modifying the Old Testament. Now, where we do run into some issues and how the Council of Nicaea plays into this, I don't know if they do or not, gets into the translations. You know, and so they have some guy that's translating the Greek version, but, you know, how good was the guy doing the Greek version in the first place? And, you know, and so I think that that's where you get into more issues, is people changing the translation.
And you were talking about, or we were talking about the gods a while ago. Now, one of my theories, and this, of course, is coming out of my head because, of course, my theories are probably based on many other researchers' theories. I just make my own assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
And let's say that I hate to use this word, ancient astronaut theory. Let's just use that. The gods came here.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why I don't want to get into the pyramids and the megalithic wonders of the world just yet, but that's the reason why we have the pyramids all over the world. The same type of technology all over the world. Of course, modern academia, they said that's just a pure coincidence. There was no travel over the seas and amongst each other, you know, cultural communication. So let's say that's all true. Let's say that the gods came here. They all had the same technology. One lands in South America. One lands in America. One lands in maybe Antarctica, because there's pyramids there.
Mm-hmm.
The Middle East, Egypt, India, China, Japan. And that's the reason why they help pretty much like a intervention. They're intervening themselves to help boost the technology and the consciousness of the human species. And that's the reason why the same type of technology occurs all over the globe. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, too many thoughts. I mean, my knee-jerk reaction is a lot of the work that I write about, I feel predates the building of the pyramids or is in line with the pyramids, and then the flood happened and everything changed. But in my movie, Icon, Deconstructing the Archetypes of the Ancients, one of the things that I look at is architectural style. Because you can tell who created something. Like, I'm just trying to think. Who's coming to mind is Salvador Dali. You know, and so people will recognize his paintings because it's the one with the melted watches, pocket watches over tree branches. And so if you see another image that looks like that, pretty much you're going to think, oh, that's that same guy that did the pocket watches, or Van Gogh. I mean, his style is very characteristic, kind of can't miss it. And so when you start looking at the architecture, you find similarities. And one of the things that, this came out of the work of Brian Forrester, not the concept, but the pictures, is that he had pictures of a pyramid in Egypt, and then he had pictures of some of the Cyclopedian walls in South America. And on some of the giant blocks, there are these knobs that stick out like little cones, and there's two of them kind of on a block. Well, that's kind of interesting, and you don't really think anything of it if you just see it in South America. But when you go to Egypt and you see blocks with two cylinder-looking things sticking out, it makes you go, Or if you go, and I think there's actually a third site that has that same characteristic construction methodology. Or
Pumapuku, I think.
No, it's somewhere totally unrelated. Or the wall in Sacsayhuaman where it's the puzzle pieces are put together and you go, how did they do that? Except they have a similar building style on a structure in Easter Island. And there's a similar building structure in China?
I think so.
You know, and so you find the same architectural style. Now, why would people make that? You know, I mean, that's kind of my thing. Well, why would people do that?
If the gods didn't come here, well, just like the theory I just explained, and they just landed all over the world, the globe. If that's not the case, and they just shared their technology, do you think it was just some type of burst in human consciousness? Maybe we were just in a certain age at that time, because, you know, they say that certain parts in the solar system, in the universe, has more energy, and it allows you to expand your consciousness. Do you think that was kind of the situation there, maybe?
I mean, I think they kind of worked their way around the planet. I mean, my belief is that there was a ruling class of gods that ruled the whole planet. You know, so whether it be Zeus or Enlil or, you know, Indra, you know, the list of names is pretty finite. They're all associated with the sky. They all carry a lightning bolt. Now, why do we have a sky god who's in charge that wields a lightning bolt, who is the, you know, guy who's all about the rules and judgment, and the characteristics that they tie to this guy in the sky are all the same. White guy, whiskers, long flowy coat. And then there's this other guy who's associated with water, and he's always tied to being a trickster or not really listening to what the bosses say. And he's associated with the education and creation of humanity. Always.
Mm-hmm.
But they're different gods because they have different names. It's like, no, we're talking, in my humble opinion, we're talking about a finite group of gods who had their minions all around. And so if I were the architect and I had my architectural students, I would think that anything that they would produce would be in a style similar to what they were trained in.
So, I don't mean to interject,
No, go
Rita,
ahead.
but where does the Genesis, Genesis 1:26, where does that come into place? It's, come let us make man after our image and after our likeness. And was that because, let's say the gods did come here to intervene? Because I've come across different researchers that believe that there have been maybe a couple interventions in the past. But I think that the one that the Bible talks about, come let us make man after our image and after our likeness, I think, according to what I believe is, or what I think is the case, there was already a natural part of evolution here on Earth. Neanderthal, cavemen, or whatever. Where did they come from? I don't know. I don't think they came from the swamps. No. But maybe, just maybe, they were already here. Maybe. Mm-hmm. And then the gods came here and they intervened, and they pretty much spliced their DNA, or gave, because they did find the women here attractive, and maybe they kind of injected their DNA to create this more intelligent species. What's your thought on that?
How much time do you got? Because
hit me with it.
Because actually, I'm working on a new book, which the title, I don't have a subtitle, but the title is called Being Human, and that's one of the topics that I address head on.
Give us a spoiler.
And, you know, there's a lot of people that write about a lot of stuff 40,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago.
Michael Cremo's one that talks about a couple of 100,000, I believe.
Well, he goes back. No, yeah. I love Michael Cremo's work because he talks about like 300,000, and I really am much more in line with Michael Cremo because he takes dates back really far. Sitchin and like David Icke are 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. That's when they feel that the Anunnaki came and genetically engineered. What I contend is that the union, so I'm kind of going backwards, so that union between the sons of God and the daughters of men and their offspring were actually Homo erectus. So we're talking about 1.5 million years ago. And so where Adam was, you date back. What's interesting is that, because I believe that they taught us, they educated us. And so the first bipedal ape also happens to be the first tool-making ape, who was Australopithecus, who actually was just prior to, well, there was one in between, but prior to Homo erectus. And so I kind of put Adam and Eve with Australopithecus. But one of the things that happens with Homo erectus is that there's a big change. There's a big mental change. They started living in communities. They hunted in groups. They have discovered what they think is some of the very first pieces of art tied to Homo erectus. They were the first to leave Africa, and they were the first to wear clothes, which comes out of the Bible. When God kicks Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden, he gives them little clothes of fur to wear. Mm-hmm. I need to learn what that little number is. But more importantly, and we've kind of touched on this, but more importantly to me is that when we look at the mythic narrative, okay, so if you have a 30,000 year date or a 100,000 year date or 200,000 year date, one of the oldest and consistent myths that we find around the world is the story of fire. But by 200,000 years ago, we already had fire. Mm-hmm. So why create a myth about it?
Exactly.
And I have more reasons, but I'm not going to talk about that. This is what I always do. When there's a splice spot.
We got you. Is any of our history as a society or species here on Earth have any legitimacy to it? Because it seems most cultures around the world are all plagiarizing each other.
That's a really great question, but I'm going to kind of go back to what I was saying before. If you have one group of gods, and if that one group of gods are educating humanity, then you would think that the stories they tell are going to be similar. So, and I'm just going to use a very simplistic kind of example. So, let's talk Santa Claus. What I know about Santa Claus and what you know about Santa Claus, I'm going to bet is all the same because it all came from the same source and we were trained in that similar tradition. And so I feel like when you start looking at these cultures, that the source of these stories aren't plagiarized, is that they came from the same source. Now, one of the things that...
through oral tradition?
Through oral tradition. I mean, there was an article that I read, I think it was from 2013, it's fairly recent, about a researcher who had gone to Australia and was checking the veracity of some of the local legends, local myths that come from that area. Mm-hmm. And they talk of a time where, because there are these islands off the coast of Australia, and they talk of a time when they could actually walk out to the island and they used to hunt deer and caribou, or I guess they don't have deer and caribou there, but they used to hunt there, get kangaroos maybe, I don't know. And then they tell how the water came rushing in. And they found very similar stories in a number of different groups all along the coast that had similar geographic configurations. And they brought a geologist in who uncovered that the land there had once been above water before we had all of the melting and sea levels rose. And they estimated that cultural memory of being able to walk out to these islands was at least 10,000 years old. Well, this is a story that has stayed with these people for 10,000 years. And so we think it's just impossible to remember, but I remember the story about Santa. I mean, there are stories that are part of our family or part of our history that we will tell our children, or there are songs that we'll sing to our children when they're children, and they'll sing them to their children. And it's not that they change. It stays the same. Person to person, generation to generation. And if it's something that's that important, mean, think about it. We've been talking about Jesus for 2,000 years, and has the story, well, has the story really changed? Maybe, but, okay. No cards and letters on that one either. You know, and so my belief is that in some form, well, actually, one of the things that I believe is that one of the things we find out in myth is that the gods taught us our history. You know, so when they were teaching us about the stars, when they were teaching us about the universe, when they were teaching us metalworking or how to plant, how to dig up roots from the ground. I mean, think about how far in our past that was. How to dig up roots, you know, like sweet potatoes. Really far back. But they say they told us our history. And so one of the questions that I ask is, when we look at these stories of the gods and them having these wars with each other and doing these pretty tawdry acts, are they really our stories about the gods, or are they the god stories that they told to us? And we're just passing that tradition on. And
with a lot of these traditions and stories, do you think that the story of the human race, a lot of the unanswered questions, was actually burned down during the Library of Alexandria?
Conspiracy or not?
Give me your wildest opinion or theory on this.
I mean, I think that there was a lot of information when you start going back into some of the early Egyptian writers, Mateo and stuff like that. He had a lot of historical information. There are a few surviving sources that come out of Babylonia. I mean, thankfully, so many stone tablets have been unearthed in Sumner, or that would have all been lost. And even more thankfully, they were in stone, so they didn't burn down. You know, but the same thing happened in the Americas. Can you imagine if they didn't burn all of the Maya documents? Because they burned hundreds of thousands of documents. You know, and all we have left are 4. We're trying to base an entire culture on 4. And so that was as bad as the burning of the Library of Alexandria, except we know that they did that on purpose. And the same thing actually happened in China, where I don't remember what emperor it was, but it was the beginning of a dynasty, and he did the same thing. He burned all of the records.
What are they so afraid of? You know, I'm going to ask you the million-dollar question, you know, but why keep the true story of our past hidden from us?
Because they can't indoctrinate you into their belief system.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
You know, so you can't sit there and say, well, my people did this because after a generation or two.
Mm-hmm. Exactly right. Now, according to, going back to the ancient aliens and stuff, according to your research, how accurate is the hit television show Ancient Aliens?
All right, even though I really should be on the show, because I'm smart.
Agreed.
They bring up some very good points. There are things that I have issues with. You know, it kind of goes back and forth. You know, some shows are better than others. Some are more researched than others.
But the underlying factor is that they have a lot of truth within it.
I think that there's a base of truth. I think the more important thing is that they're bringing forward information about an area that most people don't want to, or a lot of people are, well, not even resistant, that it's giving it exposure. You know, I have done ghost hunting, have been part of ghost hunting teams, wrote a book about ghosts and attached entities from those experiences. And, you know, even though as hoaxy as some of the ghost hunting shows are, it brought the awareness of the possibility that there might be ghosts in our universe. And so you ask people now if they believe in ghosts, and it went from a pretty small number to people actually believing that it's a possibility if they haven't already experienced a ghost. And I feel like shows like Ancient Aliens bring that forward as well.
I meant to ask you this a while ago. How do we know that the Western world and Christianity fits into this picture as well? But how do we know how accurate our past is, rather with wars or religion? Because aren't the books written by the victors? And the United States is practically ancient Rome part 2. And we all know that Rome had its filthy hands in the transformation of how society is today. So since that was pretty much the victors writing history, how do we know that what we're being fed in schools and pretty much everything else, how do we know it's true? Because what if the ones that lost the wars, the battles, what if their history was actually more accurate?
Another great question, and I'm going to kind of go to the really far mythology, because there are all of these wars. There are all of these wars that happen, and I'm not going to get into that story, so we'll just kind of keep going. And it does seem evident that the mythological history that we have received was written by the victors. I'll just leave it there. But fast forward, when I started to write the ET Chronicles book, one of the things that I had to figure out really early on was that the book wasn't for everyone on the planet. The book was for a Western audience, because anybody that has been brought up in an Abrahamic tradition, so anybody who comes from a culture that believes in one God, has been brainwashed, period. And so, because if you go to India, they have gods that fly around on Vimana, and they got a bunch of gods, and they got a god with an elephant head.
They just didn't get to write the world history. It's pretty much like Rome and everybody else.
Right, but they have their own history, which is totally different.
But of course, our modern academia kind of just shoves them to the side. And,
well, I understand that. There was a series, it was Mankind, The History of All of Us. And if people haven't watched it, I think it's on Netflix. And it was really like Mankind, the history of European expansion into the world. I mean, it was not the history of all of us. It was the history and a total propaganda piece about the Western world. Mm-hmm. And in the Western world, there's one God. He doesn't fly around on any kind of aerial chariots or doesn't do anything. Unless it's with Elijah, then maybe a little bit. But Australia, they have the sky heroes. In the Americas, they have the god, or these, they don't call them gods, they're the sky people who are on flying discs. Anywhere not in the Western world, and where I really take it down to is Abrahamic traditions, any tradition that believes in one God, because you know what? There's only one. Mm-hmm. You go to any other culture that has not been usurped by an Abrahamic tradition, they all venerate a pantheon of gods.
And while we're on this topic, you're so correct. And while we're on this topic, if I can find a question here, according to, since we're talking about the religions and everything like that, where does the origins of the underworld or hell come from? Because it seems like most cultures from around the world have similar stories.
Okay, well, you're gonna make me end up telling that story that I didn't want to, probably. Okay.
I gotta poke all the truth or all your knowledge out of you.
Okay, so in most cultures, so I was talking about individual groups of gods, or individuals. There's the sky god, and then there's the fertility god, who's associated with water. And so his home was in the watery deeps. And so, if you bring that into potentially contemporary ufology, it would be like a USO. And so when he came from his home beneath the ocean waves, like Neptune, that's where he lived.
Mm-hmm.
But then there was the god of the underworld, and he was the caretaker of the souls. So you have your Hades type individual. And hell wasn't hell. It wasn't a fire and brimstone kind of place. It was where people's souls went to rest after they died, because the gods lived in heaven. And if you were a really lucky individual, you maybe would become a god and get to go to heaven. But it wasn't that everybody went to heaven. I mean, even the Sumerian Noah, that comes out of the Epic of Gilgamesh, lives in the underworld, but he has immortality. But he didn't go to heaven, and so, but there are some stories of individuals who do get to go to heaven, like Hercules went to heaven. So there are stories, and I feel like over time, it became, well, then I can go to heaven, and you can go to heaven, if you live a virtuous life, and then if you don't, you go to this other place.
Was the, I guess, the Western mind frame of hell, or mostly the Christianity belief of hell, did that mostly originate from medieval times?
No.
Or
I think it was a development. All right, here's the story.
Or was hell made up to keep people in line, keep people in check?
Well, I mean, I think that it was definitely brought up to keep people in line, and is more of a Western belief. Although, and it took this home where the souls go and just kind of adds on to it. But here's the add-on part, okay? And so there was the war between the sky god and the fertility god. So your Enlil and Enki, or your Zeus and Kronos. But in many cultures, or in Christianity or Abrahamic traditions, you don't have a guy living under the water, and so they just kind of annihilated that position. But you had the guy that lived in the bowels of the earth, Tartarus in Greek. And so after this war, but it was won by the sky gods. And so who wrote the history? The sky gods. Well, what happened to the half-man, half-serpent character who was living in the waters? He got sent to the depths of Tartarus, which is where the Titans lived for a long time. And over time, he became identified because, see, it gets really kind of convoluted and you have to follow your characters along. So the fertility gods were always identified as being the tricksters. They're the ones that were always getting in trouble for not paying attention, and so they were bad. Well, now they're in the depths of Tartarus. They kind of got a relocation, even though they didn't get a relocation, but in the lineage they did. And so now we have this bad person who is now connected to the serpent in the Garden of Eden, Satan, there. But I feel like the original story was kind of a convolution of the fertility guide giving humanity education, and knowledge that got convoluted into something completely different.
And that's kind of where probably got, I guess, the ones that were warmongering and the ones that were power hungry on power trips. That's probably why they kind of created their ideology or whatever of hell, to keep people in check.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you can keep people in check like that, what else can you do? You can probably mind control them to do pretty much whatever you want to, But you brought up sky gods. So what is your thoughts on the Mahabharata and ancient nuclear warfare? Do these sky gods have anything to do with that? And were these nuclear wars amongst the gods, or were they the gods trying to annihilate the human race?
Okay, so I have I'm one of those sick people that actually read these books. And the Mahabharata is like 15 books long, and I'm part of the way through the first book, and it is beyond cumbersome, I have to tell you, because it's not linear in its narrative.
It's hard to keep up with it.
Well, it tells this story, and then it jumps over here, and there's kind of a story that goes through it, but I'm looking with a very specific eye, and, there are summaries, but they don't talk about Vimana. And so, from what I know and what my assumption would be, it would be a war of the gods against the gods, because who had all the magical weapons? It wasn't the humans. And even stories like the Ramayana, which I did read the whole thing of that. What's interesting, and I'm going to go back to my other thing, the Ramayana was set during the Treta Yuga, and the Treta Yuga extended from 2 million years ago to about 780,000 years ago, and Rama was in the latter part of the Treta Yuga. And so what the story tells you is that Rama gets exiled from becoming the king through a very sad set of situation, and he is exiled to the woods, and his wife and his brother join him. I love how they tell these stories, because Rama's this hero. So his brother goes and torments a giant. Okay, so now we have this whole story with these giants in it. He torments a giant, and in the end ends up cutting off her nose and I think one of her ears. And of course that's not a bad behavior because it's a giant. And so it gets escalated. She goes and complains to her brother, and he gets all of these giants to come after Rama and his brother. And Rama has this magical bow and arrow that can shoot 1,000 arrows, and he kills all the giants in one pass. But if you go back, that's right around the time that Homo erectus came into being.
What time frame are we looking at right now?
About 1 million years ago.
Now, how far back does this story of Mahabharata go back? Is there a certain date or a certain time frame?
I haven't really identified what the dates are. What we do know is that, it's tied to Krishna. And when Krishna left the planet, it was right around the time of the Mayan calendar change, 3000, I always get these backwards, 3014 BC versus 3114. And so that's when we moved from the Dwapara Yuga into the Kali Yuga. So it was definitely prior to that point in time.
So why were these gods, the sky gods, why were they fighting amongst each other?
I don't have an answer for that.
Give me,
because
it's
post-flood.
Yeah.
So everything with me is pre-flood, flood, and pre. Anything post is not really. I don't have an answer.
It feels like it's kind of interconnected, though. It seems like, because it's almost like they were trying to lay the groundwork. Like maybe one faction was trying to. Of course, this is all speculation. We're just talking, but. It seems like one faction was trying to maybe control the human race, and maybe that's why you get stories in the Bible of God and Lucifer, and you get you get the light side, you get the dark side, you get the yin and yang.
Well, I think the story of God and Lucifer were established long before, that part. And I'm going to bring in a Zachariah Sitchin notion, if I'm recalling correctly, because it's been a really long time since I read his books. But I think that one of the things he talks about is that after, I don't even remember what event it was, but that the earth was separated up into quadrants. And actually, if you look at the gods, the god of the underworld is always associated with the south. The giants, dwarfs, and master builders are always associated with the north. And then we have the sky god and the god of the underworld associated with east and west, but I can't quite figure out which is east and west because it depends on where you are in the on the planet. but they're associated with those directions. So one of the things that I have put out, although not in writing, is that I kind of feel like the Great Pyramid was a landmarker. Being kind of like the continental divide, this is your quadrant, this is your quadrant.
Mm-hmm.
And if I recall correctly, it was kind of like a land grab, that the Mahabharata was more about these lesser gods, you know, like in Rome or in the Roman kingdom, they had the Caesar who was in charge, but then when it got past a certain point, it was kind of broken up into different areas of Rome, and there were different emperors for the different areas. And so I get the impression that, you know, instead of having just one guy being in charge, now it broke up into more territories, and I think it was a land grab of one group fighting another group on the earth, but not the sky gods against the gods of the underworld.
That makes sense, because I've actually kind of thought of that myself, you know, because it seems like there's a missing, that's why I brought up the Library of Alexandria and the Council of Nicaea.
Mm-hmm.
You know, was the Library of Alexandria burned down because the true story, that true question, you know, was burnt down, or it was left out of the Bible or other books through the Council of Nicaea?
Well, you know, but there are multiple dates that they give for when the library burned, too. So, we don't know. Natural or an unsolved mystery. You know, and we've kind of been talking about this topic this whole time, where in the West, our notion of God is this tall white guy with whiskers and a long flowing robe, which is tied to the sky god who lives up there. And our belief is that this God is kind and loving, you know, but as we find out in the Bible, maybe not as kind and loving as we've been led to believe. You know, and then I suggest that maybe what we've been told in our upbringing is just really kind of a lie. And I kind of back out and bring in the cultures from around the world and talk about what they believe about God, and suggest, and I'm just going to make this kind of a simple thing, suggest that perhaps God or the gods are not immortal, omnipotent beings as we have been led to believe.
And so why do the ancients use iconography to spread certain messages in the images of the past?
Okay, great question. You know, in the past, it's like, well, one, up until about 2500 BC, there was no written language, and so everything that they did was based on some kind of symbology. And even when there was a written language, up until a fairly recent time, most people didn't know how to read. And so they could go and look at a piece of art because this was some of the information that was passed down. You know, so I'm going to give a very simplistic example, and we kind of talked about this earlier. You know, we can see an image of Santa, and we know exactly who it is. We know everything about his life. We know where he lives. We know how he gets around. And it could even be Santa in a Hawaiian shirt and shorts, and we still know it's Santa. We do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so in more ancient times, they would tie visual cues into the artwork. So when you see an image of Moses, for example, he would often be depicted either holding the Ten Commandments, or he would have two little horns sticking out of the top of his head. And so just with one look, you would know that it was Moses. But it wasn't that you just knew it was Moses. You knew the whole story of Moses, and you knew the story of the Exodus. So you didn't have to write all this stuff. You didn't have to read all of this stuff. You already knew it because it was part of the stories you had grown up with your whole life. And so that's one of the things about iconography. You know, and it's interesting, in some of the recent research I've been doing, one of the earliest pieces of art that they feel has a representational quality to it is a 77,000-year-old piece of ochre. It's about, I don't know, the picture makes it look like it's about that big. And it just has this kind of like geometric lines carved into it. You know, we go, oh, well, it's art. But in Australia, so this was found in Bilbo's Cave in Africa. But in Australia, you find very similar rocks. I mean, Stephen and Evan Strong, great guys if you haven't ever interviewed them. But they have these rocks that have a very similar kind of geometric scratches into the stone. Well, based on the principle of iconography, is there an intrinsic meaning to those lines? And if I took my Africa stone to Australia, would the Australians be able to interpret it because it has the same intrinsic meaning?
And you also mentioned the Venus figures as well.
Okay, that's the iconography movie.
Okay. I'm kind of going back and forth here.
Okay,
but is that something to do because you talk about the hand placements or something like that? How many cultures they use certain gestures.
Right. So in India, there's something called mudras, and so mudras is the name of a hand gesture, and that has an implicit meaning. So in the Americas, we have a couple of hand gestures that I'm not going to do on camera, that if someone did it to you, you would know what it means right away. And I'm not a mudra expert, but
I have an idea.
Yeah, and I'm sure all the viewers do too. But in India, and I'm not saying that this is the meaning of it because I'm not that well versed in it, but seeing a figure with their hand like this versus seeing a figure with their hand like that would bring in two different concepts. This might mean peace, where this might mean contemplation. And so it adds a different level to the meaning. And when you start looking at really ancient art, so some of the very first figurative pieces of art we have, are the Venus figures. And when you look at them, and what makes them really interesting is that they started creating these about 26,000 years ago till about 15,000 years ago. So we're talking about a lot of years, and they have found them ranging from France all the way into Russia. So it's not like it was just this little cultural group making these figures. This was an expansive range. And when you start putting them next to each other, they all have very similar properties. They all have, exaggerated sexual features. They're all kind of rotund. Many of them have what look like a hairnet on the top. But what I grasped onto, other than this similarity of figures so that you can tell, well, yeah, that's a Venus figure, is that in some of them, and I have to sit there and think, they have their hands under, on the stomach of the body, but then on other ones,
where at?
Down on the stomach.
Okay.
Down here.
Yeah.
But then on other ones, their hands are placed just above the breasts.
Okay.
And, based on that notion of iconography, what does that mean? Are we talking about being a representation of two different intrinsic meanings to those different hand placements? And one of the other things that I bring forward in that film that I think is really important is, based on my belief that we're talking about a finite number of gods, can you take a figure from one culture and based on its iconography, make the assumption that it is actually the same character from a different culture that you might have more information about, or an additional piece of information? And one of the reasons why I made that movie is that I was talking about things that were so visual that, it makes it kind of hard to even talk about. But, one of the examples I give is in Sumerian culture, when their images of Enki are portrayed, he is always shown with these three like fountains of water kind of coming off of his shoulders, and sometimes there's little fish in the water, and that's his iconography. So if you see a guy with these fountains of water coming off his shoulders, you know you're looking at Enki. Period.
Mm-hmm.
You know it. Kind of like looking at Santa. You know it.
Does that have anything to do? I don't want to get really off topic because I'm covering most of your iconography and a little bit of the Holy Deception.
Mm-hmm.
But most of my questions are for the iconography. But does that have anything to do with the time of Jesus being the fish?
No.
You know, because of Enki being part of, I guess, symbolized as the fish also?
Right, but he was a fertility god that lived in the water.
Yeah.
You know,
so there's no comparison with that at all?
Well, the only comparison would be that he was the kind benefactor of humanity, so maybe that's where they're kind of pulling the kind benefactor card.
True.
But what I found interesting, and I'll just make this very quick, in Inca art, they have a little water deity. Okay, so it doesn't have a name, it's just a water deity. And it's this figure with these three spouts of water coming off its shoulders. So could that water deity actually be an Inca representation of Enki?
Is that part of the Starbucks logo too? Is it?
No, that's a siren. Siren.
Okay, because
that's a woman.
I was thinking it was part of that same type
she's
of...
kind of like a mermaid siren.
I was just thinking water,
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking. But it's crazy how all of these things kind of tie together across the world, and that's what I love about your research, your books, and the documentaries, is that they all kind of tie together like a puzzle piece. And let's kind of skip forward because I got so many questions, but just a little bit of time with you is... Let's go to Easter Island.
Okay.
And, I'm asking you the $1 million question again, Rita.
Okay.
Who created the megalithic Easter Island figures? And are they similar iconic statues that parallel in comparison to the Easter Island statues in other parts of the world?
It's interesting, and it's probably great that we talked about the Venus figures, and I was showing you how they had their hands, on their abdomen. When you look at the Easter Island figures, if you actually look at them very closely, their hands are always placed, on the stomach area, or, kind of like on their hips, and their fingertips are always kind of pointing down. Mm-hmm. Where I think it gets really exciting to me is that you see a very similar, and he has like a belt on, which is kind of holding up a little clothing item. The word is passing me by right at the moment.
Yeah.
Like a little G-string thing, but he has like he has his like utility belt on, and but where it gets really exciting is that one of the upright pillars that they found at Göbekli Tepe has an anthropomorphic figure. There's no head, but it looks like a belt with these two arms coming down the sides of the columns, and where it kind of comes to the front around the corner, this guy has his hand next to the belt, so that it really does look like, and these kind of like long finger things too. And there are actually a few other places that you see this belt with this hand position on really remote areas. But the one that's the most fascinating, I think, is Göbekli Tepe, because, they know that it was intentionally buried 8,000 to 9,000 BC. So that says that the concept of that imagery goes back that far.
And so what about the winged disc? What exactly does the winged disc symbolize? And do different cultures across the world have similar meaning as the Egyptian winged disc as well?
All right, so the winged disc, you know, and I'm actually going to kind of change culture because I think people are familiar with the image of the winged disc, which is why in the video I started with it, because I wanted to start with something familiar, and then here we're going to go talk about this over here. You know, but the winged disc is kind of like the sun, and it has two like angel wings coming off of it. Isn't that kind of like the Harley logo? But anyway, but where that history starts is actually in Sumeria. On some of the cylinder seals, there is an image of Anu in a circle, who is their supreme deity, and around the circle are these wings, you know, like his little aircraft wings. But then it was consolidated and into a regular circle that had like 8 lines going through it. And so that was considered the Seal of Semaj. And so if that seal was present in a document or in a representation, it meant that the spirit of the god was with you. And so that was kind of the underlying message. But it was the spirit of the god, which is the guy who's in the winged chariot flying around guy.
Well, that's what a lot of ancient alien theorists do subscribe to or believe, is that the winged disc proves ancient flight.
Well, I mean, it's in mythological record.
Yeah.
So, and I'm just going to say this. So, I think, well, all right, I know I've been told this, but in my films, I never say the word alien. And even in my book, ET Chronicles, I rarely say the word alien, because I just say that it's the gods. Because it's not my place. You know, I mean, I really come from a place of myth. You know, so there's my opinion, and if you ask my opinion, I'm happy to give it. You know, but if people listen to what I have to say, I say, well, this is what the mythological record says. You know, and so I'm just relaying that back. And the mythological record never says aliens. Although it doesn't really take a huge leap.
Yeah, exactly.
to get there.
And does this tie, because we're talking about the Sumerians a little bit, but what is the feather of the serpent, and what is the significance of the serpent carrying the purse on the ancient Mesopotamian tablets?
That is still the $1 million question, because, okay, so there are a number of Sumerian as well as, I think, Hittite seals or images that show either a god or this bird-like character carrying what looks like a little hand purse. But where it starts getting interesting is
he's just carrying his wife's makeup and jewelry.
That's right, yeah. To me, where it gets interesting is that one of the earliest carved tablets that come out of the Olmec, so the Olmec predated the Maya, so supposedly the Olmec were, you know, 1000 BC or before that, is this figure of a person sitting inside a serpent with one of those purses. You know, so now, to me, if I find it in more than one culture, and I don't mean like it's in Greek and in Roman, because that's, you know, but if I find it in Sumeria and then I find it in the Americas, now there's something going on. And I don't remember off the top of my head where it was, but they actually have unearthed carved representations of these purses, and I think there's like 50 of them now, and they have all different kinds of designs and patterns. So are those images of the purses that these people carried, or are they representations of these purses that people kept in their house as a, you know, we have lost the code. You know, we don't understand what the intrinsic meaning is. You know, if it's 1,000 years from now and we don't ever talk about Santa anymore, in 1,000 years, if they see his picture, are they going to understand what the intrinsic meaning is of that? Or one of the things that I joke around about, you know, in 10,000 years, archaeologists are going through a dump pile and they find this cup with the images of a golden arch on it. Are they going to assume that we ritually worshipped the god of the golden arch? Or perhaps a goddess named Wendy's? You know? And so we make assumptions about what some of this stuff is, and we don't know because we've lost the decoder ring and we don't have the answer key, and it's only through the oral tradition, which so many dismiss, or, you know, that we really have any kind of clue as to what they are, because we don't have that big of a written tradition. As you were saying, the Library of Alexandria burned. You know, the Mayan Chronicles burned. What came out of China burned.
And to move forward just a little bit, but we're still, you know, we're talking about this feather of the serpent, but why do most cultures across the world use the snake representation as a benevolent creature, but Christianity uses the symbol of the serpent as evil?
Well, I mean, you know, serpent, tied to that fertility god, half man, half snake. You know, when you look at images of that character, I mean, I believe that that character, and I'm just going to say Enki just for ease here, but when you see images, it's usually depicted kind of like a centaur, the upper body of a man with the lower body of a serpent. Locomotion, I can't really imagine how they would get around, but that's kind of a different story. But the visual images were based on an oral tradition that talked about this half man, half snake, reptile, fish character. And so is it our conception that it had the upper body of a man and the lower part of a serpent? Or is it more David Icke-esque, and they are actually talking about a reptilian humanoid, so they have a humanoid body, but they're reptile, which would still be a half man, half serpent.
Exactly. But Rita, we're running out of time for this time, and I really appreciate it because you, just like I told you earlier, I feel like a fat kid in a candy store. You know, I don't know where I want to go with this. I have tons of questions, but you did a very good job in explaining a lot of this. And just like I said, your works with your documentary and your books, they tie together perfectly like a puzzle piece.
Thank you.
And that's what I use with a lot of researchers, because I use your puzzle piece that you created with your research. Makes a big little image right there for me that I use in other researchers, and eventually it creates a better picture and understanding of things. And I really appreciate that, and I appreciate your time today.
Well, thanks for having me on. I had a blast.
All right, thank you.